Have you ever looked forward to something, been so excited for something, only to end up completely let down? Maybe it was an Amazon order you placed recently. It had 5-star reviews, pristine photos. People were raving about it online, but when it showed up, it was actually toddler-sized, or it smelled weird, and it looked nothing like the pictures that you saw online. Maybe it wasn't something you bought on Amazon. Maybe it was a vacation spot you booked one year. You booked it online, and online it looked perfect. It looked exactly like what you wanted, but when you showed up, it ended up being moldy and under construction. Whatever it might be for you, it's a common experience when our expectations don't align with reality. And it's actually such a universal experience that we've turned it into a comedy show. And one of my favorite baking shows is actually called Nailed It, where they put amateur bakers to the test in a kitchen competition to try and recreate a masterpiece. And I want to show you just a few examples of why I love this show so much. And on the left side, what you're going to see... Oh, right there. Perfect. What you're going to see is what they were supposed to make. This is what was expected of them. And then on the right side is the reality of what they created. Here's another example. You can see how the expectation and the reality don't really line up, do they? And here's this final one. The expectation and the reality, they don't line up so much. And we all laugh because we've all been there, haven't we? Maybe we've hoped for something and it didn't come through the way that we wanted to. And while we're remembering these photos, and these photos are funny, there was a time in my life where it was actually a little bit more personal. And it was when I was about 16 years old, I was in high school, and I loved to play in a garage band. I played drums like you saw this morning. And I'd saved every penny from my birthdays, from my Christmas, from all the chores that I did that year. And I had been piling up my money because I wanted a brand new drum set. And I had my eyes on a particular one. It was a Ludwig drum set. It was maple wood. It had this ombre stain finish. It was just beautiful. I saw it when I was perusing Guitar Center with some of my friends, and I was sold out on it. This is the perfect set. This is the one I wanted to spend all of my hard-earned cash on. Now, while I was there, I didn't have the cash on me, and I rode my bike there, so I had no way to get it home. So I had to ride my bike home, and I told my mom as I grabbed my stash of cash, this is the drum set I want. I'm counting my cash once again to make sure I had just enough to go buy it, and then I convinced her, go with me the next day so we can go pick up this drum set. And the overnight wait was excruciating for me. But finally, we drove there, I walked in the store, and I walked up to look for the drum set, and it was gone. It was missing. I was freaking out with the cash in hand, so I ran to the clerk, and I was like, where did that drum set go? And he said, oh, that drum set was beautiful, wasn't it? I was like, yeah, it was. And he's like, well, I just sold it a couple of hours ago. And just like that, my dreams and my expectations were crushed, and I was devastated. But you know what? I did not know that a couple of hours ago, some of my bandmates had gone to that Guitar Center and purchased the drum set for me. They pulled all their money together. They bought it for me. So when I got home, I was so disappointed. I was so heartbroken. And then as soon as I opened the garage, there it was, all set up for me with my friends right around there, ready to jam on it with me. The drum set, my drum set, it was there waiting for me. So what looked like a disappointment to me was actually a setup for something better. What looked like defeat was actually the beginning of joy. And that's exactly what we find in the Easter story that we are looking at today. There are some women who came to the tomb expecting disappointment. Their hopes and their dreams were crushed. But what they found was more than they had ever expected. A risen Savior, a resurrected Jesus, an empty grave. And because Jesus is alive, our reality can be better than our expectations. And so this morning, we're going to be reading from the book of Luke, and we're going to see what happened that first Easter morning. Luke's gospel, it's an eyewitness account of Jesus' life. And Jesus was from a small town called Nazareth. And he spent about 3 years teaching people about God, where he healed the sick, he performed incredible miracles. But not everyone loved him. The religious leaders of the day, they felt threatened by his growing influence and authority. And he challenged their authority because he claimed to be the Son of God. And so they conspired against him and had him executed. And Jesus, all the while, he knew that this was his eventuality. He knew this was going to take place. In fact, he allowed it to happen because he knew his suffering would be a part of God's greater plan to bring about salvation to the entirety of the world. So he willingly endures the suffering, and he died a sinner's death, even though he himself did nothing wrong. And this is where we pick up the story this morning. Jesus was killed and he was placed in a tomb. His followers are devastated. Their hopes were dashed. And they had just been trying to make sense of their heartbreak and their sorrow at this moment. And so today we're going to walk through the story that we find in Luke chapter 24. And what we're going to see is that if we want to reclaim life, we need to regain hope and anticipation for what God can do. And we're also going to see that faith doesn't have to start with certainty, just a simple step. So our text today, like I said, is in the book of Luke chapter 24. I'm going to read it starting in verse 1. The text will be available to you on the screens beside me. And it says this: On the first day of the week, very early in the morning, the women took the spices they had prepared and went to the tomb. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they entered, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. While they were wondering about this, suddenly 2 men in clothes that gleamed like lightning stood beside them. In their fright, the women bowed down with their faces to the ground, but the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, he is risen. Remember how he told you while he was still with you in Galilee, the Son of Man must be delivered over to the hands of sinners, be crucified, and on the third day be raised again." Then they remembered his words. See, the first people to see the empty tomb on that first Easter morning were a few women who were taking spices to his tomb. And taking spices to the tomb was a normal custom back then. It was a sign of love and respect, much like how we bring flowers to a cemetery today. And the point of this is that they walked to the tomb that morning not expecting for Jesus to have risen, fully expecting him to be in that tomb dead. But much to their surprise, they saw the large stone rolled away, and there were 2 radiant men there. Luke later refers to them as angels who were present at the tomb. And after inquiring to them, "Where is the body of our Savior?" they respond to the question, "Why are you looking for him among the dead?" In other words, why would you think that he would still be dead? Didn't you believe he would do what he said he was going to do? And then the angels reminded them of Jesus' own words when he claimed that he would die and resurrect 3 days later. So as we read, we are starting to find out that Jesus really meant what he said. And upon reading this story together this morning, what I marvel at and what takes me back is the loss of hope that these women had. Because they witnessed Jesus' death, and they were in a state of mourning. And they showed up that first Easter morning to mourn their defeat rather than claim their victory. They didn't show up to the tomb in anticipation. They were not full of hope. It wasn't like they were living like it was New Year's Eve, like a countdown clock was coming until Jesus would take his first breath. It wasn't like that at all. They didn't show up with that kind of anticipation. That wasn't what they thought was going to happen. They came expecting a dead body, but they left that tomb remembering a promise. And it was only after the angels reminded them of Jesus' words that they began to regain their hope. And the angels didn't give them any new information. No new revelations were given. They just reminded them of what Jesus had already said. And sometimes if we need to regain our hope, it doesn't require a brand new revelation, just a remembrance of what we've already heard. See, a lot of us, we live in a world that feels really heavy. The news headlines can easily weigh us down. We can be overcome by our grief, by our anxiety, by our disappointments. Sorrow is our constant companion sometimes, isn't it? And it's tempting to walk through life like these women walked to the tomb that Easter morning, without hope, without anticipation. And rather than focus on what God can do, what he might do, we tend to focus instead on what he hasn't done for us. And when we focus our attention on what God hasn't done for us, we might have a tendency to walk through our lives in the way the women did, with our heads down, our hearts broken, just going through the motion. But that would be living like it's still Saturday. But Easter Sunday has now come. Jesus' body is no longer in the tomb. Therefore, there is joy and there is hope for those who choose to believe and follow Jesus. It can be so easy for us to operate in a mode of defeat rather than victory, can't it? And maybe right now you find yourself in a season of life where it's really hard to find hope, where you're still carrying around your burial spices like it's Saturday, where death has won out. The powers of this world have won out. Maybe you're holding tight, and your spice is the baggage of what you've experienced and the hardship that you've had to walk through. What would it look like to receive freedom from that, to be able to let go of that baggage? Well, Christ's victory, he offers that kind of freedom for us today. Maybe you're cynical because the church has hurt you in the past. Let me remind you of God's power. And let me remind you of that so that it will bring you hope into a brighter and better future. Maybe right now you're walking through some relational hurt with someone who was close to you, who wounded you. Maybe you have anxiety about your children or the way that you're parenting. Maybe you're plagued with this mindset of perfectionism. I have to be great until someone can actually love me. What if you're feeling weighed down by life because you haven't yet claimed the victory that was given to us through Jesus' resurrection? Well, would you consider what it would look like to maybe partner with him and experience some of that hope again this morning? Because I believe we want to be people who reclaim the fullness of life, experiencing joy and hope the way life is meant to be. It needs to start by regaining an anticipation for what God can do. Easter began with women who were expecting to find Jesus dead, but it turned out to be a moment of remembering a promise and reclaiming hope. The same can be true for us today. Romans chapter 8, verse 11, it reminds us, and if the Spirit who raised Jesus from the dead is living in you, he who raised Christ from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies because of his Spirit who now lives in you. The resurrection is no longer just past history. Its power is still at work and available to us still today. And if that is true that the same power that raised Christ from the dead is available to us today, can you imagine how that might impact your life? So when we hold on to the idea that God can do the impossible, it will open up our hearts and our minds to new possibilities. So let's be a people who continue with anticipation, awaiting for God to show up and to see what he can do. Something incredible can happen. He raised Jesus to life, and he's still working in our world today. Some of us, we've been living like it's still Saturday, and it's time to claim Christ's victory over the grave, to reclaim hope and start living like Sunday has finally come. On Easter Sunday, some women, they started out attending a funeral, but it turned out to be the start of a movement that would spread to the hope to the ends of the earth. So let's pick back up the text as we see the news the women received begin to spread. Picking up the text in verse 9, it says this: when they came back from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and to all the others. It was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary, the mother of James, and the others with them who told this to the apostles. But they did not believe the woman because their words seemed to them like nonsense. Peter, however, got up and ran to the tomb. Bending over, he saw the strips of linen lying by themselves, and he went away wondering to himself what had happened. These three women who encountered the empty tomb and the angels who were present there, in the ancient culture, the testimony from these women would have had very little credibility. And we see that in the text. As they were telling this story, what they had witnessed to the other disciples, the text tells us that the disciples considered their words as nonsense. Their report to the disciples seemed so bizarre that they thought to themselves, maybe they're just overcome by their grief and they aren't seeing things clearly. They're really confused, and now they're just trying to make stuff up so that they don't have to deal with the sorrow that they're experiencing. And if you've ever experienced loss of someone close, you know that grief can make you want to think things like that. And that's what the disciples thought was going on here. That's why the text tells us it seemed to them like what they were saying was nonsense. And yet Peter, he responds differently. He's still grieving, he's still unsure, but he decides to bolt it and he runs to the tomb. And it's not because he fully believed, but because something in him was willing to ask, what if it is true? And I love this moment because it shows us that belief doesn't always arrive all at once. Oftentimes, belief comes in stages. And the first stage that we see in this is just hearing the unbelievable claim. At first, the news was so unbelievable, it seemed like a fairy tale. It sounded too good to be true. It was inconceivable, impossible. I can't believe this. And that's exactly how the disciples received the stories when they first heard it from these women. And then we see step 2, where Peter decides to check the evidence. He decided to run to the tomb, check the facts for himself. And when he got to the tomb, he didn't just believe right then and there. He looked at the evidence and he was puzzled, wondering to himself, what happened here? See, even in that second step towards belief, he hasn't yet come to believe. He's simply just investigating what has been shown to him. He's perplexed by this situation. And as the text continues beyond what we read, we see a powerful progression of belief as two other disciples have a personal encounter with Jesus on the road. And they're so overwhelmed with their grief that they don't even recognize Jesus as he walks up next to them. It's only when he starts reading the scriptures that they can then finally see him. So in their stage, they had to encounter Jesus personally before they could believe. And the text continues beyond that, and Jesus reveals himself to all of his disciples as he breaks bread with them. And it wasn't until he begins to commission them, take this message and share it with those around you, that they finally believe. You see, even for the witnesses of the first Easter, the resurrected Jesus, their belief came in stages. They didn't get there instantly. Their belief was a process. And in the same way for us, faith doesn't require perfect certainty at the beginning, just a willingness to take the next step. Even the disciples had their doubts. Peter was wondering, but they continued to lean in, and that's when their faith began to grow. See, we live in a world right now that prides itself on proof and evidence, where we Google every single answer, we track every step, we demand evidence for any claim. And what that has produced for us, when we have the information at our fingertips, is that by default, we are skeptical of anything we hear. It has to be proven to us. We have to be shown the evidence. And the reason for that is because we've been hurt in the past. We've been misled before. We've found ourselves being disappointed. And so we've learned that we need to keep our guard up. And people need to prove their information before we can actually accept it. And we see that same thing happening in this scene as well. When those women heard the claim that he has risen from the angels, it sounded unbelievable to them, and it sounded unbelievable to the disciples. And that's what confronted the women at the tomb. But it wasn't just a metaphor, it wasn't a comforting symbol that he has risen, but it was historical. It was a physical empty grave that they witnessed. The angels didn't say, maybe he's risen and walk out. They said, no, he's not here because he has risen. So today, we're not just remembering some kind of hypothetical story that'll make us feel good. We're actually wrestling with this question, what if the unbelievable was actually true? And what is interesting is that Christianity is really unique in that claim. Because other religions, they offer moral systems, they offer wisdom, they offer spiritual insights, but they don't try to claim what Christianity claims. Because Christianity hinges itself on the single historical event, the resurrection of Jesus. Other religious founders, they're still in the grave, but Jesus predicted his death and also his resurrection, and then he actually pulled it off. This isn't just some spiritual metaphor, it's a historical claim. Christianity doesn't rest on just good advice, but actually good news that Jesus Christ is alive, and because he lives, everything changes. See, the disciples, they didn't just believe in this because they were trying to start a movement. They were trying to pull a hoax on people. Their claims, they weren't based on a lie. They believed because they actually witnessed something that was real. There's a New Testament scholar called N.T. Wright, and he is quoted as saying this. He puts it in a really organized fashion. I love his wording. He says this: the early Christians didn't invent the empty tomb, the meetings, or the sightings of the risen Jesus, because nobody was expecting that kind of thing. No kind of conversion experience would have ever invented such a scenario. So to suggest otherwise is to stop doing history and to enter fantasy. You see, we don't get to see the empty tomb, but we do have the recorded historical facts that evidence the resurrection taking place. And so I want to give you just 3 of the many reasons there are to consider the resurrection as historically credible. You see, in Paul's first letter to the Corinthian church in chapter 15, verse 6, he references that after Jesus' resurrection, he appeared to more than 500 other brothers and sisters at that time. Paul continues in that verse, essentially saying that there are many of them who are still living. So if you don't believe the pen that I have written to you, go and ask them for yourselves, because they witnessed it. This mass experience, it affirms that the resurrection wasn't just a private or emotional experience for a few of Jesus' closest disciples. It was a public event. It was witnessed by a huge group. which gives a lot of weight and a lot of validity to the transformative nature of this Christian faith. More evidence for the resurrection can be found as you take a look at Jesus' closest disciples, because a few of them throughout the gospel recordings are depicted as cowardly. But then somehow after Jesus' resurrection, they went from cowards to now being martyrs. Many of Jesus' disciples were brutally killed. Peter was crucified upside down, James was stoned, Paul was beheaded, and the list goes on. But people don't willingly die for something that is a lie, do they? They don't die for a hoax this kind of way. Rather, people become martyrs for something they truly believe in, don't they? And one of the final evidences I'll give you today comes from the story that we read this morning, the fact that women showed up in the tomb and were the first witnesses of the resurrection. Because if you were going to fake a story back then, you would never use women to try and prove a point that would actually be believable. They weren't considered a trustworthy source. It would only have been written this way if it was actual recording of a historical fact. So if you find the resurrection hard to believe, let me tell you this morning, you're not alone. Because even the first disciples, they didn't believe right away. But there are more than just these facts that I've listed that provide evidence for the resurrection. And if that's something you want to explore, I encourage you to go do that. But coming back to our question, what would it take for you to believe the unbelievable? Because we don't have the opportunity like Peter to run to the tomb to see it for ourselves, but we still can take a step forward to examine the evidence, to learn more of the stories, to ask our questions openly and honestly. Because faith doesn't require perfect certainty, just a willingness to take the next step. And so this scene, it doesn't require us to believe it upon the first time we hear it. Jesus didn't wait until all of his disciples believed before he finally revealed himself. He actually showed up to aid them in their process of belief. Let me recount for you the doubts that we've experienced so far in this passage. The women, they forgot Jesus' words and his claim to be risen again. They thought he was dead for reals. The disciples heard the first witness and they thought the story was made up. Peter, he wasn't sure, but he ran to go see anyways to see what they were talking about, and he was still puzzled. The disciples had Jesus appear to them and they couldn't even recognize him. And throughout all of this, you know what? Jesus didn't once rebuke any of his disciples for their unbelief. He just continued to show up every step of the way. And in the same way, I want to remind you this morning that he's not intimidated by your doubts that you might have. He just wants to meet you wherever you are at. And so let me ask you for a moment, where are you on your journey of belief? And what might your next step be? Because I want to encourage you, after hearing all of this today that we've talked about, it does not let you be passive in response. You cannot stay still. Even if you have doubts, let me encourage you, be like Peter and go and examine the evidence and find out for yourself if this is true or not. Sure, you can have your doubts. Don't stay still. So I'm wondering if those of you in this room right now who have your doubts, would you be willing to just take that simple step this morning of leaning forward to find out more information about who Jesus is, to see if there is any validity to his claims and what he did? And if he is real, and you're considering that, would you ask him simply just to reveal himself to you and wait and watch as he does so? Faith doesn't have to start with certainty. It's just taking a step. And so when God does something miraculous like the resurrection, it always serves a purpose. And so I'll remind you this morning of the many purposes that Jesus' resurrection served for us today. The resurrection, it confirms for us that his words were true. If Jesus had power over death, that when he says that any of us who believe in him will receive eternal life, it means that we can trust him because the resurrection validates every promise that he has made. It also reveals that the kingdoms of this world have no power over us. Jesus overcame the grave, so there's no earthly force that can defeat us if we belong to him. The resurrection also gives credibility to Christianity itself. The resurrection wasn't just a metaphor or a mystical idea. It was a real historical event where heaven touched earth and rewrote the rules of nature. And then finally, the resurrection gives us meaning in the midst of the tragedy we experience. In our darkest moments of hardship and of difficulty, the resurrection reminds us that God is in the business of redemption. He can bring purpose out of pain. He can bring beauty from brokenness, just like he did in Jesus' life. But above all, what the resurrection does for us is it should give us hope this morning. Hope, by definition, is a feeling of expectation, a desire for a certainty for something to happen. And for those who follow Jesus, hope means that we get to live with confidence that the risen Jesus Christ isn't finished yet. He is still going to show up. He is still at work today. We began this morning talking about how life can so easily let us down. Our expectations can come crashing down really hard against the results of reality. And I shared the story of the excitement I had when I was buying a drum set, only to find out that it had been sold. I experienced disappointment, frustration, confusion, but what looked like a letdown was actually a setup for something so much better. Because my bandmates already bought that set for me as a gift, and the moment I received it, my disappointment turned into joy. What if the things that you thought were a disappointment were actually a setup for something better in your life? In Luke chapter 24, we saw that this dynamic on an eternal scale. The women showed up at the tomb expecting sorrow, expecting closure, but the tomb wasn't empty. Or the tomb was empty, not because someone stole the body, but because Jesus had taken death's power. And because Jesus is alive, our reality can be so much better than even our expectations. So we'll remind you of a couple things we saw this morning, that if we want to reclaim life, we need to regain hope and anticipation for what God can do. And faith, it doesn't start with certainty, just a simple step. See, Jesus is alive, and because of that, it changes everything. This means that we can live with resurrection hope even in a world that may feel to us like a graveyard. The book of Romans tells us that all have sinned, all have fallen short of the glory of God, that we need a Savior to come and redeem us. Jesus paid that penalty that we deserved on the cross, and his resurrection proves that his words were true. And if you want to join him in that resurrection life, it starts simply by recognizing your sin, confessing with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, and turning and following him. If Jesus is alive, what would it look like to live with expectation, to live with fullness of hope and joy in your life again? To take a step, even if you still have questions. So if you're curious about Jesus, about who he is, about what he said, I want to invite you to simply text Jesus to the phone number that'll be available on the screen, or scan the QR code. Because this will give you a resource where you can continue to explore who Jesus is and the claims that he makes and how he is still available and how he gives us an invitation to join him still today. You see, Jesus is worth exploring, and I invite you to do that. If you don't want to use your phone for that, you can take the little sheet, the little square that was left on your seat this morning, and you can fill out your name, your phone number, or email, and then check that box. I want to learn more about who Jesus is, and I would love to invite you to do that. You can go ahead and leave that on your seat as you leave today. You don't have to put it in a box. You don't have to give it to anybody. Just simply leave it on your seat, and I will collect them after service is over. There's no pressure, but this is a simple journey to continue exploring who Jesus is, his claims, and the invitation that he has made available for you. But imagine if we could live like Sunday was actually real. Imagine if this church was known not for mourning, but actually celebration, for living in the fullness of hope, the fullness of anticipation, the fullness of love and joy and faith that comes from believing that Jesus is still alive and still at work in our world. It can change everything. So next week, I want to invite you to join us back as we're going into our new series, Disenchanted. It's all about what do we do when the things that this life promises to bring us happiness leave us feeling empty. And it's going to be a real and honest reflection of what the world offers and how we can find hope in the midst of it. The hope that can only come from a God who has the power to overcome the things of this world. You see, we have hope because Jesus is risen.